Right, I don't detect any surge of energy around the board on that front, so let's capture the energy and take it on to the next item on the agenda, which is the allocations. Before, Paul, I invite you to introduce the paper, can I just remind the board of its governance responsibilities in relation to this? This is an exercise that we're about to undertake of enormous magnitude and complexity with very substantial implications for the population of England. And I would ask the board to bear that in mind. To bear in mind also that nowhere else in the world would an independent board be capable, be invited, be empowered to take the decisions that we're being asked to take today. And that carries with it an enormous responsibility. This is a decision or set of decisions that are to be taken without any party political input, but looking entirely within the framework of the 5-year forward view and the other principles that Simon has just outlined to us. In terms of the governance, and I come back to this deliberately, I just want to emphasize and to remind the board that we are not coming to the exercise cold this morning. This is not a sort of traditional exercise in which the executive side present proposals to the non-execs and the board somehow stumbles towards a conclusion. This is an exercise which has involved every member of this board in the early development of the thinking of the strategy. Remember, this is the 4th year in which we've done this, an allocations exercise. In trying to factor the implications of the 5-year forward view and the stabilization to which Simon has referred into the allocations. We have had some early development strategic meetings of the board with the executive team in which the board has given the executive team some steers against these criteria. On Monday this week, the commissioning committee formally considered the draft paper as it stood at that stage, and we have taken on board input from every member of the board, and there has been a subsequent set of iterations. So this is a multi-dimensional, complicated exercise, and we as a board need to be satisfied at the end of this set of deliberations that, one, we all understand what are the implications of what these decisions are for the 5-year forward view and for our other criteria, and be content to sign them off. There are some options which we'll be invited to address in the paper, and I would hope that by the end of our deliberations we have come to a point where we can assure ourselves that what we are doing is in the best interests of carrying forward our commitments and our strategy. So on that note, Paul, may I invite you to introduce the paper, please.
Thank you, Malcolm. So welcome to the 3rd stage of a journey that we began back in 2013. We accelerated that journey in 2014, and I think I would say that this particular leg in 2015 is, if you can have a bigger leg than other legs, I'm not sure. Anyway, it is the biggest leg and certainly the one which will have the biggest impact. It's a journey, of course, towards fairer allocations, giving every health economy the best possible chance of succeeding in the challenging times we're going through. And it's a journey also to use allocations to support the transformational strategy for the NHS, which will have profound implications for how we invest our money. I make no apology for the fact that this is a fairly complex set of proposals, because we're having to wrestle with a whole series of and propositions, competing priorities which need to be reconciled. For example, the stabilisation that you've talked about, Malcolm, of the NHS, and the need to make the forward view happen as quickly as possible. For example, sorting out underfunded CCGs in particular and wider health economies, at the same time as not completely destabilising those which are currently overfunded. Moving to fairer allocations, closely aligned to the ever-improving set of target allocations we've developed, and at the same time focusing, as we are required to do, on the needs of the most deprived communities. And finally, holistic place-based allocations, which is very much the theme of where we're trying to get to in the health service at the moment, but at the same time having to have realistic allocations for individual organisations to manage to in the years ahead. So there's a whole series of interesting polarities that we need to reconcile in these proposals. Our crucial task, obviously, today is to deploy 560 billion, that trips off the tongue, of precious taxpayers' money in a way which demonstrably maximises impact on the pace of progress towards the 5-year forward view, which of course is what unlocked the relative fiscal generosity of the settlement for the NHS. As Malcolm has said, we need to make decisions today which will stand the test of time, especially because this time round we're making choices for the next 5 years rather than just for the next year or possibly 2. So we need to make sure we get these right so that every health community has the chance of being successful in the one-off opportunity it's now got to shape its future in the 5-year planning processes, which we'll be talking about later today. So it's worth perhaps spending a few minutes over the paper as we go through. Before moving on, I would just like to thank the Allocation Steering Group, which brings together CCG colleagues and NHS England regional and central teams, and indeed the finance working group that we run with the NHS Clinical Commissioners Group, both of which have contributed significantly to the proposals you have in front of you. I should say, as a measure of the commitment of those two groups, I had an email from a very hard-working GP and clinical leader from Swindon this morning, Peter Crouch, at 1:43 this morning to be more precise, with his confirmation he'd been through all of the numbers that I'm about to present, and despite testing them to destruction, had not managed to find anything which was particularly suspect. So thanks to Peter and to the whole of those groups for making my life more interesting by emails at 1:43, which I have responded to, but not necessarily at 1:43. Also, thank you to the allocations team, who have done a miraculous job of converting the settlement achieved at literally 5 to midnight on the 24th of November into a full-blown multi-year, multi-strand package in 15 action-packed days and nights. Some of the team are here. Many of them are resting from that experience, no doubt. So much for preamble. If you turn to the paper, which you should have, I hope the members of the public who are in the room have got access to the papers that have come round, and it should be on the website as well at this point. I'm just going to canter through as best I can a longish paper, but I'll do it in 3 main legs to give you a chance to recover in between. Simon's already spoilt my first bit, as always, which is the main things we're trying to achieve. They're set out under the summary of benefits of the package in the cover note. I'm not going to re-rehearse those. They'll come back as the paper goes through. Obviously, finance directors are more thorough than chief executives, so I have a 4th, which you see at the bottom of that list, which is to incentivise and encourage and support the long-term collaboration between commissioners and providers, in particular around the planning processes that we're going to be talking about. So we're trying to find ways, and you'll see the proposals at the back of the paper, to use the allocations, to use this opportunity of 5-year allocations to encourage shared strategic planning, supported by both visibility of the projected commissioning resources that you can see there, and some incentives around joint planning related to the allocations themselves. We're trying to, at the same time, find the opportunities to pilot things like shared financial control totals, which, as I say, are not directly related to the allocations, but I think are an important part of the suite of things that we can use to move forward in a rather more joined-up fashion. But I'll come back to that if we survive the next half an hour or so for further discussion when we get to the back end of the paper. So in the main paper, then, you can see set out on page 3 the settlement as it's come through. Simon has already rehearsed its main facets. You can see in the middle of it the 3.8 for 16-17. You can see that there is another healthy slug of real terms growth in 17-18. We then have a couple of years where we're more reliant on our own efficiencies coming through to generate the capacity to invest. And then in 2021, the Chancellor throws off his cloak of austerity, and we all go to a slightly more generous regime in 2021 when we can continue to increase the pace of transformation. I would stress this is real money for the NHS. It's real money that comes from a combination of both the Chancellor and the Treasury and wider government, and from significant savings that the DH, the Department of Health, is making as a contribution to generating them. But for us, it is real new money that will come through, and it is real growth in addition to real terms protection, obviously, for inflation, which is on top of the numbers that you can see there. It comes in 2 phases, or rather the priorities for what we do with it come in 2 phases, and I think it's really important that we have that clear in our minds as we think about the allocations. The first thing is in 16-17, as I'll explain, for a variety of reasons, the priority has to be to refloat, to restabilise, to correct a number of the financial imbalances within the NHS as it currently stands. and that is going to consume the vast amount of the resource that we have available to us in 1617, and I'll come back to that theme. There is a small amount of additional transformational capacity that we will have in 1617, but really it starts to kick in 1718 onwards, and it builds through the period. So those twin goals, both there from the start, but they begin with a focus on the restabilisation, and then gradually we can do rather more on the pace of the transformation. We will use the clarity which this particular settlement has given us to give what the system has been asking of us repeatedly, which is visibility and certainty around the resources that will be available to plan with and then execute those strategies. So that is what we will do. We will set out 3-year allocations which are binding, and 2-year allocations which are more indicative in character. As always, there are terms and conditions that apply. They're set out later in the paper in one of the annexes. Clearly, if unexpected events take place, we'll have to revisit those things, but it is our firm and serious intent that we're setting out clarity for the system for 3 years firmly, 2 years indicatively, which they can then act upon. That puts a big onus on us, of course, today to have the foresight to know how to allocate that money across the various priorities that we've got, because if we're doing it for that period of time, it's got to be robust. So can I just check before I go into the detailed proposals? It isn't one of the questions perhaps that were posed in the question in the paper. Is the board comfortable, content to commit funds in the way that I've just set out before we come to how we commit them to ensure that we've got the clarity going forward?
I think, Paul, there's some important caveats around things that may change, which give us the opt-out in case things fundamentally go different.
Of course, absolutely.
We just need to recognise that.
They are set out, I think, in the first of the annexes in the paper if people want to look at them. But yes, we have clearly had to set out a variety of circumstances in which we would have to reopen elements of the settlement. So let's move on to the first of 3 decisions then. The 3 decisions, I'd remind you, they're the same as the ones we had last year and the year before. Firstly, how do we want to distribute the money between the various commissioning streams for which we're accountable? How much goes to CCGs? How much goes to primary care? And so on. The second question that we have to address is what is the method by which we target the money within each of those streams to best reflect the need, the met need and the unmet need which results in those streams. And then the third question, having established the target funding for those various commissioning streams by organisation, how quickly should we move from where we currently are in allocation terms to the allocations that we have set out as the targets? Those are the 3 discrete decisions, and I'll walk us through each of those decisions in turn. Beginning first then with the all-important, I think, this time as always, distribution of money between the commissioning streams. I've rehearsed in paragraph 6 the principles which are largely consistent with what we have done in prior years, but all the more important this year, I think. Firstly, as Simon has set as one of his tests for the spending review, so we need to set for ourselves in these allocations the reasonableness of the efficiency challenge that we're setting for each of the streams. Clearly, we're going to have to stretch to deliver the sorts of efficiencies we committed to deliver in the forward view, but it's important that we have equal ambition on each of the streams for which we're accountable. Secondly, we've got an existing instrument of policy strengthened through the forward view of ensuring that primary care, and in particular the medical part of the primary care, but indeed more broadly, primary care receives a strong amount of additional resource to do the job that it needs to do in the forward view. And thirdly, as part of the way to create the capacity to put more money to the front line and to have the funds to resource our transformation, we have had to bear down heavily on the central budgets which NHS England itself administers, and you'll see the evidence of that in the flow of money that we have got. We are reconfirming the commitment that we made last year to parity of esteem. In other words, ensuring that the investment that goes into mental health is as strong as the investment that goes into all other aspects of health, and the sorts of rules, or indeed the specific rule that we put in place for 15-16, whereby investment in mental health by each CCG and the system as a whole needs to be at least growing at the pace of the rest of the allocations, we will maintain as we take this forward through this longer period. Secondly, the commitment to the Better Care Fund will continue in the current form. More broadly then, over the next few paragraphs, I've set out the pressures that are faced by each of the commissioning streams, because clearly the allocations to each of them needs to cover, as does the spending review itself, the pressures that we face in each year in each commissioning stream. We've derived these directly from the modelling that was done for the spending review itself, and essentially just parcelled up the spending review assumptions into the commissioning streams. Simon's already mentioned it, but essentially in looking at the 3.8 billion that we've got in 16-17, it's important to remember that we enter the year with a provider sector deficit of something in the order of 1.8 billion. There are many who would say that might end up being a little bit higher than that, but the assumption in the spending review at least is we've got a 1.8 billion deficit. That needs to be funded and has been funded within the 3.8. I'll come back to the way in which that will be done. Secondly, we have about £1 billion of pensions pressure, in new pensions pressure in 16-17, which needs to be funded within each of the commissioning streams. So if you start from 3.8, assume that the 2.8 that I've just described is necessary, you can see what we've got left after that. Pulling out just a few of the strands, I just want to light briefly on specialised commissioning. I think this is an important discussion for the board here. In the modelling you will see in the table, which I'll come to right at the end, you'll see that we have allowed for 7% of growth in allocations for specialised commissioning and 4.5% to 5% of growth in specialised commissioning after 16-17. The momentum level of pressure after all available efficiencies in specialised commissioning is of the order of 4.5% to 5%. If you look back over history, if you look now, that is broadly what it is. What we're facing, however, is an unprecedented stream of major advances, to be welcomed in many ways, in highly effective drugs, highly effective treatments in specialised commissioning. Unfortunately, those same effective treatments have the unifying characteristic of being typically extremely expensive in terms of the absolute amount of money that is required to bring them forward. So we've had to factor that into the 16-17 estimates, which is why you've got 7% rather than 4.5% to 5%. But I have to tell the board that is an exceptionally low estimate of the pipeline that we're facing of these drugs and treatments, even in 16-17, and there is a substantial risk in setting it even at 7% that it will be significantly greater than that. Secondly, the assumption that we can then live with 4.5% to 5% after that requires some belief about where that pipeline is going to go in future years. The proposition I put in the paper is that something is going to have to give. We're going to have some serious discussion about the pace at which these particular treatments get adopted. We're going to have some very interesting conversations, I think, with the industry about how that can be made affordable. And we're going to have to think carefully how things we do in other parts of the pathway can reduce the amount of pressure on specialised commissioning, because the only other way that I can do this is to give more growth in 16-17 and even more growth in the subsequent years to specialised commissioning. And the only three places that can obviously come from is CCG allocations, which are needed to do all the things locally that we obviously have been discussing extensively and will discuss in the planning discussion. Secondly, primary care, and that would go directly contrary to the particular strategy that we've got to ensure primary care is geared up to deliver the transformation, or the transformation funds themselves, which I'll come to, which clearly would hold us back in taking all of those things forward. So we've got to find a way of making sure that specialised commissioning can be contained within the sorts of numbers that we've got in this sheet. In the paper it says, can we take them down further in 16-17? I think it's an interesting thing to put in the paper. I can think of no strategy which would get it lower than what I've got in the paper for 16-17. So we might want to come back to specialised commissioning when we finish this particular session. On page 5, we get into the transformational and sustainability elements that we've allowed for in our allocations to commissioning streams. We've got 2.1 billion in 16-17, rising to 3.4 billion in 2021, shown in the numbers. That's made up of a transformation element to cover 7-day services, GP access, cancer, mental health and prevention, and a variety of other things. And then in 16-17 in particular, the sustainability element of the fund, which is designed to deal with, once and for all, the provider deficit that we have built in 15-16 to bring the provider sector back into financial balance, and that will be discharged. I think the press release, the announcement was made yesterday in two parts: a general element which will go to all providers of emergency services, and a targeted element which will go to those who can make additional efficiency gains, with some very strong elements of conditionality around it, which is designed to ensure it's not just money that deals with a deficit, but in so doing causes a focus on the things that are really important for the provider sector as much as the commissioning sector to address, around setting the financial position right, around delivering the core constitutional commitments, and around the transformational work that we're trying to do, for example, through the integrated planning processes, which will very much be a process for commissioners and providers to address together. So it is a fund to deal with a financial issue, but it's a fund which also has to fulfil a strategic purpose in getting focus on those things as well. Over the 5-year period, the 1.8 that we use next year for that sustainability fund will continue to be available to us, and to the extent that we can get it to leverage big efficiency gains in the provider sector, we will be able to liberate some of the 1.8 billion to add to the other resources for transformation that we have got to make up a bigger pot for us to speed up the pace of transformation. So that's the purpose that we have for it. And we will also, as time goes by, explore how much of it needs to be retained and managed on a national basis, and as a matter of policy, how much we can get rapidly to the front line in the form of devolved access to those funds. In the context of which, let me just mention in slightly more detail the point which I think Simon alluded to in his introduction, or rather his report, which is that as part of the transformation funding, we have agreed with Greater Manchester to carve out 450 million, their fair share of those available transformation budgets, for them to discharge in the context of their health and social care strategic plan, where they are ahead of the rest of the country at the moment in addressing the sort of integrated planning that we will come to in June or thereabouts with the rest of the country. So I would just invite the board specifically, it's not stated as one of the decisions that we are requiring of the board in the paper, but when we come to the end of this section, which I'm very nearly at, it would be good if you could express your support or otherwise for that particular allocation to Greater Manchester, which I was discussing with them yesterday, but clearly was subject to your approval today. Just worth saying, I talked about efficiencies earlier. Clearly we've built into it the 2% provider efficiency, which has been previously discussed as being the level that will be put in the tariff consultation to come out shortly. But we've also factored into here the activity-related savings, which, if you remember the forward view, kick in progressively as we go forward with our transformation. These have been built in as activity-related savings, predominantly in the back end of the period of modelling. There are two important caveats which reflect back to Simon's opening, that clearly our ability to drive those activity-related savings will, to an extent, be dependent on the level of public health investment behind prevention, and to an extent also the degree to which we are insulated from social care underfunding aspects should that not be resolved. So those are quite important caveats around the activity-related savings. Clearly, you'll recall what the activity-related savings are derived from. The biggest single engine of that numerically is the Right Care programme, which we've discussed a number of times, and is our key instrument of allocative efficiency, getting rid of waste and variation, but also the new models of care and self-care are also required to make their contribution in the latter part of the period. And if all of that comes together, which is our expectation, you get Table 2, which describes the place-based commissioning budgets in the first few lines. In other words, the things which represent local commissioning activity, whether done by CCGs for themselves, whether done in delegated form or otherwise for primary care medical services, or whether done through our hubs, but increasingly through co-commissioning with CCGs in the specialised space. You can see those budgets as they build there, and in particular the strong growth that we've allowed for in primary care. You can see the Sustainability and Transformation Fund in the next line, which I've broadly discussed already. You can see other direct commissioning, which are the other services, the small number of other services which we commission as NHS England. You can see the declining amount of NHS England central budgets, which reflects the earlier comment that I made, and then the ongoing use of drawdown, in other words, use of historic surpluses to deal with non-recurrent investments, and also to deal with CCGs who are still in deficit. And one hopes that will be a declining number as we go forward, as we correct the allocative efficiency in the latter part of the proposals, and secondly that will be used as an additional kicker to the transformation that we've been talking about. So that's probably enough for me on allocation to the commissioning streams. I'm open now to either questions or a decision of the board as to whether these should be the allocations to the streams. Malcolm.
Right, please let me invite questions. I'll take the formal approval at the end of the item, if I may, but I would like to take questions at this stage or comments on the introduction we've had from Paul. Kieran, please.
Thanks, Malcolm. Lot to like, obviously. No surprise, you know, the place-based stuff is really good. 3+2 is far better than doing this every year. Consistent with what we've been saying. I suppose, the specialised commissioning one, you alluded to it, Paul, but this has to be about reducing demand as much as it is also about saying what are the more innovative ways of paying for this stuff, because unless it's both, I just can't see how the numbers work.
Okay.
And the other side is if we have 7% inflation, or even 4.5% inflation year on year, we will never make the strategic shift. So this is existential, I think. And it's, you know, maybe it's not for now, but it's, you know, we really need to say what are we going to do to make that happen, so we don't get to 17, 18 and say, oh, magically it's supposed to be 4.5%.
I agree.
So that feels quite major, and there's a cultural thing in it as well, because, you know, the example that always sticks with me is, you know, my previous life, colorectal cancer. We know that recurrence falls if it's about exercise. So it's not only saying, you know, can we be more efficient in colorectal cancer surgery, but it's around saying, actually, we really need to, not only for the benefit of the patient, but we really need to convince primary care that exercise is a good thing, and by the way, it'll have a knock-on effect. So there's a huge cultural thing behind this as well. So it's not just the technocratic thing here.
Totally agree. Yeah.
It's kind of an endorsement, but it's it's an existential one, I think. Question.
So, I agree with everything you said. I think 3 strands to that, one of which is I think we might want to do a bit more thought leadership around that as part of the input to the integrated planning that is coming along. Secondly, in the integrated planning, it is our intention that specialised commissioning will be very much part of what is done in the relevant localities. The third thing is in the Right to Care programme, I would say specialised commissioning has been a small part of it to date. As we roll out the Right to Care programme, it would again be very important, I think, that we integrate insights into specialised commissioning and potential opportunities there to shift the way in which the whole pathway is managed. So that might give us another entree into the question that you raised.
And it's why population evidence and place-based is so critical, because otherwise we're just building a better sailing ship. And
Agree.
actually we need something which has a bit more steam power or something.
Thank you.
Margaret, and then David.
Paul, thank you very much. Can you just clarify for me the 1.8 billion fund that's allocated to deal with the provider deficit is predicated on our realising a 2% efficiency, and we're starting from, if you count now as year 0, that we've already realised 2% efficiency. What's the link if at the end of this year don't quite realise that 2%? What's the link between that and the 1.8?
Well, I think it is very clear. So the 1.8 is all we've got to solve the provider challenge next year. So if we don't enter the year with a 1.8 deficit, if it's higher than that, what's going to happen is that in setting the control totals that NHS Improvement will do for each of the individual organisations around the country as part of their entry to the scheme, so to speak, additional efficiency will have to be built in over and above the 2% on an individual basis to get down to the level at which 1.8 does eradicate the provider deficit. So it's really, really important that this year every effort is made to get down to that level already. because that will be the best way to ensure that next year the 2% is what is needed. But as you rightly point out, if that isn't done, it just ups the requirement in next year of individual providers, and particularly the individual providers who haven't managed to hold their expenditure this year to the level implied by that. One of the other things I should have made clear, perhaps, because I think it's easy to misunderstand the 2% as being a massive reduction, as it were. 2% needs to be real efficiency, real delivered productivity on the ground, not notional efficiencies, not hypothetical efficiencies and all that sort of stuff. So there's a hard edge to the 2%. It's challenging enough, certainly given the kind of recent trends in underlying productivity, and it's got to be 2% that really does take cost out of the system.
It might be worth Paul just adding, though, that the 1.8 and the 2% can't be seen in isolation from the approach we're taking on tariff, which will be subject to consultation. So there's also a 3.1% cash uplift built into tariff. So the sequencing of this is that providers saw that we were going to be proposing the 3.1% cash uplift and a more modest 2% efficiency, i.e. at least a 1% rise in prices, and thought, okay, that sort of sounds constructive but doesn't go the whole way. And then what we're doing yesterday and today is putting another 1.8 billion on the table. So it's those pieces combined that I think mean that the provider sector rightly believes, certainly as articulated by NHS Improvement and Jim Mackey, that this is a feasible and doable settlement for next year.
Thank you. David?
Well, actually, I think that a lot of my question has just been answered, really, which was about the exit positioning, and if that was worse, how we would handle it. I think maybe if I can maybe, though, move on to the Transformation and Sustainability Fund. Clearly, it's absolutely critical that the Sustainability Fund has real teeth in terms of ensuring ongoing improvement and efficiency. Otherwise, we do not have the degree of transformation funding that we will need in subsequent years. So I guess my question, Paul, is to what extent do you think, and how can you reassure the board that there is sufficient conditionality on that sustainability funding that will give us confidence that the deficit positions in due course will get better, not worse, and also that those who have managed their finances the best will be in a position to be recognised for that?
First question first. So the conditionality, I've broadly alluded to it in the paper. I think a lot of it was set out in the announcements yesterday. But there will be 3 areas of conditionality, in broad terms, with sub-elements of that. The first being the fundamental financial one. So to your earlier point, if organisations don't hit the control totals that have been set or don't achieve the efficiencies which are set out as part of that control total, in particular around implementing the agency measures that have been taken this year and will continue into next year, in particular in terms of implementing the work following Lord Carter's study on efficiency, clearly that conditionality will bite, and it will be very specific conditionality around that. The constitutional standards I've mentioned already, and they will be the ones that you would expect. And then thirdly, in some ways, I wouldn't say the most important, but almost equally important, is the engagement with the transformational agenda. And for me in particular, that centres around the quality of engagement and the quality of the content of the integrated plans that every provider will be getting together with its commissioners to produce in the summer. And again, I'll come later to conditionality around the commissioner engagement with that, but there's a direct mirror image of that in the conditionality around the sustainability element of the fund.
Well, may we turn to specialised commissioning, because
yes.
you outlined to us what are the implications if we didn't cap it at a 7% growth rate, and the implications for taking funding from other spheres. I think what the board needs to know as well, what assurance can you give us as to the realistic character of that 7% cap, and in particular in relation to high-cost drugs and medical devices and the change in character of new drugs that are coming through, and whether you're confident that this is a realisable number?
Well, first thing to say, I guess, is I wouldn't put it in the allocations if I didn't think it was a realisable number. It isn't a balancing figure that I've generated to make the numbers balance. it is the one that worries me most of all the numbers in the 16-17 position for the reasons that I've set out. And to an extent it worries me because there is, as things currently stand, not a great deal that we can do to manage the flow of these things in. I think that's the bit that we need to change going into 16-17, because if it's outside our control and we've got a budget to manage to, it is really quite tricky. So it is the biggest area of risk. I think I've made that clear to the board as I went through. It's a realisable figure, but it's a figure which carries a substantial amount of risk attached to it. And we've seen in recent years, for different reasons, the specialised commissioning budget overspend. We believe that we've got the Cancer Drugs Fund through the consultation that's currently underway to a point where we can manage that in an appropriate fashion. You've seen in the results for this year that the grip on the operational performance of specialised commissioning in its normal, if there is such a thing in specialised commissioning, its routine regional commissioning, you've seen that come under significantly better control and grip than it's had before. The element that is most challenging is this flow of drugs coming in, and there we will need, I think, to take assertive action to hold it within the budget.
And I think on that, should the board approve this, then this is something that we will want to track very carefully over the coming year and beyond. Let me invite any further questions, Paul, on this part of the paper before we move to the next stage. No, Paul, please.
Okay, turning to page 7 then, we come to the middle bit of the three, which is the setting of the target allocations for each of the commissioning streams. A really important piece of work, which Simon already alluded to, is the work on inequalities. We made big progress on that in the formulae that we talked about last year, indeed the year before. We've done more work on it this year, partly in the search of the Holy Grail as to whether there's a much better way of doing the inequalities adjustment, and I have to disappoint the board by saying that despite a substantial amount of research and looking around the world at other ways of doing it, we have not come up with anything better than we had before. We looked with great interest at some work which is alluded to in the paper by Ben Barr and colleagues, which indicated some kind of marginal impact of greater investment in deprived areas than others. It didn't lead us to anything that, by his agreement, I have to say, that was actionable in the form of a different form of inequalities adjustment. So we have what we have. We have extended the inequalities adjustments necessarily to include one for specialised commissioning, where we're introducing a formula, as I'll come to in a minute, for the first time. And we have made, again, with ACRA's advice on this one, a refinement to the way in which we measure the inequalities, which we then attach an adjustment in the formula to make it more sensitive to the highest end of deprivation as we measure it through the metrics that we use here. So we've gone from a 10-tier system to a 16-tier system, the top 6 tiers being, if you like, a more granular way of looking at the most deprived economies, and that gives us a better fix, I think, on the position. It will improve the sensitivity of the formula in that particular way. So we've built that in on inequalities. We'll come back to that if people wish to discuss it. Secondly, we've obviously updated, as you'd expect, for population in general for all of the formulae. All of this is done on registered patient lists, etc., and therefore the appropriateness of those patient lists is important, and work has gone on to ensure that that remains the case. On the CCG formula, we've essentially updated everything that moves in the CCG formula by something like 4 years in general, from when we first set the formulae to the best information that's available now. We've made some minor changes to the emergency ambulance cost adjustment, which you don't need to detain yourselves on because it has a very small weighting within the overall formula. The much more important part of the changes we've made to the CCG formula, at least for some parts of the country, is the introduction of a sparsity adjustment. There's a whole annex which sets out the work that we've done on that. But the end consequence of that is that 6 CCGs in relation to 8 remote sites around the country will have an additional element to their allocations which reflects our best judgment on the necessary additional costs which are faced by people who, because of their geography and catchment area, have to operate at less than economic scale. So we've introduced that to it. You can see the net effect of all of those things, and I should say all of those changes have been agreed in detail with ACRA, which is, as you know, the independent body that kind of advises us on all of this stuff. The net effect of that, you can see set out in terms of the distance from target in the table at paragraph 32. It does slightly increase our challenge because it generates a few more underfunded CCGs, the combination of all those changes, particularly in areas where there's been rapid growth, I think, in those CCGs. But broadly speaking, it doesn't fundamentally shift the pattern of the target allocations, but it gets us to a much more robust and defensible point of reflecting the need in those allocations. So that's essentially what we've done on CCG formula. There is a fundamental revision to the primary care medical formula that we have. We've moved on from the Carhill formula basis that we had in previous primary care formulae, which were 15 years old, which feels a little bit long in the tooth for something we're doing current allocations on. So we've moved to a new basis of doing that based on stratified workload of GPs in dealing with particular demographic types of patient, if I can put it that way, and in so doing then updated by those 15 years or so, the accuracy and meaningfulness of the need estimation that comes from that. Again, ACRA has endorsed those changes. Important to say that we're not at this stage changing the formula by which we pay GPs. That's a wholly separate stream of development, but at some point we'll need to bring the two things a bit closer together over time. And we're not changing the other elements of primary care, the dentistry, the optical services and community pharmacy at this stage. And we're not, I should say it because I might forget otherwise, we're not including that in the place-based calculations later on because they are typically not ones that we're doing through co-commissioning, etc. So they remain a central activity to a large extent. So that's the change to the primary care formula. Again, for those who like these things, there is an annex with all the technicalities in it available for people. And then the real excitement of the year is the introduction of a specialised formula, clearly important if we're going to do specialised now on increasingly on a co-commissioned basis as part of place-based allocations. We've based the workings of that formula on the methodology we use for the CCG formula, but clearly the dynamics of specialised are different. So you can see that set out. I'm now moving into page 10. There is a particular challenge in specialised because, as you will be aware from all sorts of other discussions we've had, the data for many elements of specialised is more difficult to come by than it is for routine CCG commissioning, if I can put it that way. So there's about 50% of the specialised portfolio where we've got a strong enough set of data to be able to build a formula around it. And for those 50%, we've constructed said formula and deployed it. For the other 50%, rather than making up numbers or extrapolating in some strange way, which would not work because specialised is characterised as being different in its various components rather than homogeneous, we are using existing baseline spend. So effectively there is no stretch between current and future spending in those parts. Clearly, as our data and as our cost capture for specialised improves over time, we will be able to build a more comprehensive needs-based formula, but for now we've only built in needs basis where we've got robust data to do that with. So that's the specialised formula. I need to draw to your attention that this has been done during the course of the year, has taken quite a lot of effort, and as a consequence of that it hasn't yet got the ACRA stamp of approval. We've had positive discussions with ACRA around the formula, but important just to state that they haven't yet completed the work they would need to do to say it's entirely what they can endorse. We will complete that work, to state the obvious, I hope, and we'll complete that over the next few months, but we are inviting the board to proceed with putting in specialised formulae on the basis that we've set out. Should ACRA come back with anything substantially problematic in that respect, we'll clearly then need to decide whether we restate or do some adjustments for that. But it is my expectation that ACRA will be able to support it, but clearly that's a matter for them when they have a chance to run the slide rule over our formula. So I'll come back later to the arguments as to why I think it's really important that we do build specialised commissioning into the pace of change, into the place-based allocations, but you can't do that without a formula, and I'm inviting you to adopt this particular formula. And finally, in this section on kind of formulae and target allocations, just important to say that all of this has been through a variety of quality assurance processes, as you would expect that we do each year. They're set out there in their various components, so it has been done to death, I think would be the best way to describe it. It's been done at pace, however, and as a consequence of that, I am suggesting that having taken whatever decisions that we do today, We will take the next few weeks just to double check the specific allocations to individual organisations to make sure that no glitches have crept in. At the moment, all of that appears to be very positive, and as I mentioned this morning, we've had a number of independent people looking at that and finding it plausible. I would just like, given the complexity of what we're about to come to have the opportunity to personally and with colleagues just review the final set of numbers that emerge, the consequence of which would be that we would publish the numbers for CCGs and the other components of place-based allocations in the first week of January, rather than rushing them out before Christmas. I think it's also important they're going to need quite a bit of communication and explanation because it is more complex, and I'd rather do that when people were focused on coming back for work rather than focused on going off for turkeys and trimmings. So that's my proposal, at least in terms of the handling of that. That's all I wanted to say about the middle piece of this triptych. If there are any questions on the formulae, that would be fine.
Thank you, Paul. Let me invite questions. No?
Paul, as you know, in Specialised Commissioning Committee, John, myself and Margaret receive frequent representations from different patient groups who are concerned about the pace with which we implement co-commissioning of Specialised. Am I right in thinking that the revision to the specialist formula does not in itself accelerate co-commissioning of Specialised? It provides a facility to do that should we wish, but its equal objective is to provide a better allocative efficiency of Specialised, even if we continue to do it on a more centralised basis.
I think there's a one-word answer to that, which is yes, you are right. Sorry, that's 4 words. Yes, you are right. It has the allocation method has no impact whatsoever on who does what job. We are very keen, however, for reasons which will become apparent when we come to the next section, to encourage the maximum possible engagement of local economies with specialised commissioning. But that doesn't imply that there is a change.
But that decision is taken X the formula.
Exactly right, exactly.
But as you know, what it does do is exemplify the fact there's no free lunch. So, for the people of Greater Manchester or the people of Cumbria or the people of Lewisham, if we're putting X 100 million more into hepatitis C treatments next year, then that's X 100 million that's not available for primary care or mental health. And at the moment, that has been invisible to the naked eye locally. Now this makes it much more transparent.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
I don't detect any other questions coming forward, Paul, so can I invite you to continue?
Okay, so fasten your seatbelts, if you would, for the challenging part of all of this, and frankly, for the next 10 minutes, the least strategically kind of enwrapped part of the discussion. So bear with me, please, because we do need to get this right, because whilst the strategic stuff is incredibly important, if we mess up the technical stuff, it will all be entirely invalid. So bear with me if you would. We come to pace of change and how we move from current allocations to future allocations, nearing as closely and as rapidly as possible the target allocations revealed by the things we've just been talking about. Let me remind you of some of our particular policies which are frankly taken forward from last year and given additional power through the 5-year allocations that we're about to discuss. So firstly, we do want to bring all CCGs to target funding over time, and specifically we have a commitment which we've made to ourselves and to the PAC, I would say, to bring those who are more than 5% under target rapidly, i.e. next year, to being within 5% of the target. That's a commitment we made last year. I'm pleased to say that if you accept either of the variants of the proposals that we've got in this section, that will be delivered, which is a great relief to Simon and me, because otherwise we'd have to go to the PAC and explain why we weren't doing it. But it's an important thing for us to do. Equally, we have set out on a journey of bringing primary care into alignment with target formulae, and we are continuing that journey in a way I'll describe in a minute. In doing all of that, though, it comes back to my ands earlier on. We need to make sure that we're mindful of value for money and ability to adapt at pace. So we've, in constructing the rules of engagement around pace of change, we've been very mindful last year and this year of how those who get additional growth, how much can they meaningfully invest and achieve value for money on. Equally importantly, those who have lower increases because they are overfunded, how quickly can they adapt, their spending patterns to come in line with the future allocations. So that gives us, I think, a variety of considerations as we go through the next phase. The additional complexity this time, so up to now we've always been talking about individual allocations and how we do pace of change. The additional thing is that we've got to achieve the other and which is to get the equity right, the equity of allocations at total place, which is where all of the things for a population come together, at the same time as keeping the job for individual commissioning streams doable. So it can't have a CCG that can't do its job because its total place allocation is brilliant, but it's all in the wrong part of it. So we've had to manage both levels of that in the proposals that we've got here. There are 4 ways set out in the paper that we could think of doing that. The first is to look at each individual commissioning stream individually and continue to do what we've always done. I guess I've not presented that as a very credible alternative, and it isn't, so it's there for completeness. The second thing we could do is just to ignore the individual streams and go to the aggregate level, get all those allocations right, and then move forward. That doesn't really work either, whether or not you include specialised commissioning. So, frankly, I've tried to dress it up as 4 options, but there is only one that fulfills the criterion that I set, if you managed to notice that one, which is the hybrid option, which seeks to both get the total place allocation to where we need to get it, but set some rules, if you like, for the individual components, which ensures that CCGs will still be able to commission sensibly with the allocations they've got for their part of the total place, and similarly for primary care and specialised. So I commend that to you. At paragraph 49, the reasons for including specialised are rehearsed because it is our conviction that it is important we move forward with the specialised allocations as part of the place-based set of changes. The major reason, and if necessary the only reason, is it's simply inequitable to give people CCG allocations which take no account of whether they underuse, overuse, or whatever specialised services, which is effectively what we have been doing today. We've been blind to that, partly because we haven't had the data to do it with. It's inequitable to do that, so therefore the total place, including specialised, starts to bring in the holistic view of where the total spend across a population is taking place, and enables us to take that into account in setting the future allocations. The second thing is it will support the co-commissioning that Noel quite helpfully brought out in the earlier discussion if we bring all of that together. The third thing to say is that it will give us the transparency that we need of it. As I say, we've been a bit blind to that. And the fourth thing is this is a movable feast in the sense that we're refining continuously what is specialised commissioning. We're moving forward with trying to get greater consistency across the country, for example, with the rules by which we identify what is a specialised activity and what is not. And over time, there is a likelihood that we will change the balance in small or bigger ways between specialised in a careful and planned way. But if we don't have all of the allocations coming together in the way that the pressure is set in the system, though each of those changes will be a struggle because the money will be in the wrong place and we'll have to revisit our allocations. So I commend this to you as a future-proofing of our strategy for allocations, as well as something which is a fundamental equity issue. There are some downsides. As I've mentioned, the formula is quite a complex one and it's come together, hasn't yet got ACRA approval. That brings with it a degree of risk. In the paper we talk about the fact the partial service coverage is simply the 50% for which we haven't got a proper formula, which we've therefore done without a needs-based formula, just on actuals. My argument to you would be that actually dampens the risk rather than increasing the risk, because there's part of it, and actually the more volatile part of it, which we are not bringing a pace of change element to at this stage until we've got a robust way to do that. So I make the argument there that we should proceed, including specialised. We are quite happy, obviously, to discuss that when we get to the end of this. So there are then 3 steps to holiness in this particular one. The first one is to apply those basic rules to each of the commissioning streams to ensure that the basic requirements to run a CCG allocation, a primary medical care allocation, and a specialised allocation are in place. That does not consume all of the growth that we have got for each of these commissioning streams, and therefore we take the growth capacity that we've got after that step and model it at the total place stage to get a total pace of change introduced into the system. Having got a total pace of change sorted out, we then have a third step, which is to pass all of that money back down into the 3 constituent allocations, the CCG allocation, the primary medical care and the specialised care. If that sounds complex, it is a little complex, but it is the best way to reconcile those two priorities of having total place-based equity and allocations we can work with at the individual levels. All of the rules that we've applied in the first of those stages, and indeed the second of those stages, derive directly from the things we discussed last year. So a priority to get people no more than 5% under target is enacted as a basic rule in each of those streams. Secondly, we've got minimum per capita growth, which ensures in particular that those who are growing fast, which was one of our concerns last year, are getting a growing allocation as this goes through. Thirdly, that every CCG gets a minimum level of cash growth, in other words, the absolute allocation that they get, which to some extent gives protection for slow-growing CCGs and gives them a chance to adapt over time. To a more important extent in this particular context, we've ensured that CCGs in particular, and primary care actually, have enough money to deal with the pensions pressure that I talked about in year one in 16-17, irrespective of all the other pace of change that we do. And then when we put all of the 7-day service money out in the allocations, which in this model is in 2021, we will see whether it comes out earlier than that, but by 2021, clearly it would be important that every CCG had the wherewithal to pay for 7-day services, so we've added that in. So that's what that little second step does. And then the last one is the one where we've made a bit of a change in the proposals to you. So last year, if you remember, we capped the growth for those who are more than 5% over target, those who are receiving each year significantly more than the target says the needs of their population, both met and unmet, should demand. We capped that at effectively real terms growth last year, no more than real terms growth, even if they had growing populations. That is not getting us traction, frankly, in bringing their over-targetedness, if there's such a word, down to sensible levels. So in the proposals we've got here, at least in option 1, we are going to make, particularly for those who are over 10% over target, we're going to bring that down to effectively flat cash, plus those specific pressures that I talked about, in order to accelerate the pace in a reasonable way, but nonetheless accelerate the pace of those organisations, some of which are 20, 30% over target, and will never, frankly, get back to any alignment with their needs-based formula unless we accelerate that in the way that I've described in the paper. Those are the rules for the CCGs. There are similar rules for the primary care medical allocations. Given that they are as similar as they are, I won't repeat all I've just said in relation to that. In specialised, we have in this first instance no particular rules other than that everyone gets the same per capita growth, because given the volatility of specialised, we think that's the best way to handle it. I'll come back to its impact in the total in a minute. So that's the first stage. That gets you to basic allocations for CCGs, primary medical and specialised. We then turn to the second of those and apply a similar set of rules to the total capacity we've got at place-based level, total of those three, in order to discharge the total capacity we've got for growth funding. That will channel it to those who on a total place basis are most underfunded, irrespective of whether they are underfunded in the individual components or whether they've got mixes. We've got every possible mix across the country of underfunded CCGs, under and overfunded GP services, and a similar dispersion of specialised commissioning. So the end result here is the most equitable way to make sure that in total place-based terms, the people who are most underfunded get the biggest growth in that particular dimension. So that's the second part of it. And then we've got rules set out in paragraph 53 as to how that goes back to the individual component allocations. I'll let you read those for yourself. It effectively tries to get the money to the part of the allocation which is most underfunded, which I think you'd find a logical way to try and give the capacity that that results in. We will spend a lot of time communicating, I can assure you, with CCGs and with our own teams about exactly how all that works and why it makes sense in the end, because it's easier to do with a set of worked examples than it is in a set of paragraphs in a board paper. But rest assured the methodology works and will be communicated in that way. And we are offering you two alternatives, really, one of which is what I've just described, which is option 1. There is a second option, which is to be less redistributive at the overfunded end and to revert effectively back to what we did last year, which is to continue to protect in real terms the allocations to those who are significantly overfunded. The consequence you can see on the following page, which I won't take you through every number on, but just to give you a sense of the differential performance. So this shows at the top the DFT, the distance from target distribution. The simplest way I can explain it is that as of 1617, if you see the green blocks on the chart, that says there is no CCG and no total place in the country which is more than 5% under target in the proposals. That is true of either of the proposals, both the more accelerated and the less accelerated. You can see we get to the point, a rather exciting point in 2021, if that isn't too far to look ahead, where on a total place basis, we don't even have any CCGs that are more than 2.5% under target, which I think is a worthy next step to take once we've conquered the Everest of getting to within 5%. You can see that there is significant convergence in the top section. I would draw to your attention, for example, in 1819, which is the end of the firm allocations we're doing, 164 in the middle, you can see CCGs are within 2.5% either side of allocation. That's the best part of 80% of CCGs in the central zone around the target allocations. And as you can see, that extends as we go forward. So it does what it's intended to do. You can see in the middle block the range of growth that is applied to various CCGs. In 1617, it is noticeable that a number of CCGs will get significant amounts of growth. There are a relatively small number of CCGs that get the sort of growth that are in the maximum, lest CCG finance directors now be rubbing their hands together and looking forward to receiving a cheque for 10.79% growth. That is one CCG which is massively under target, which would get that. That is the span of it. You can see the mean, median and minima if that sort of thing interests you. There is more capacity in 1617 to do things than there is in the middle years. In 2021, again, we have a slightly bigger dispersion of the numbers. If I contrast that with option 2, which you're invited to look at, you end up with more people, as you'd expect, who are significantly overfunded at the end of the period, inevitably. In fact, we don't really make much inroad in that at all because it's simply such a big degree of difference that many of these CCGs have. We just need to start to deal with that. You can see also that my wonderful goal of being within 2.5% or no more than 2.5% under target doesn't get achieved in the final year. I would say that's by a small difference, actually, so I wouldn't overstate that. It's also worth saying the financial differences between the top and the bottom table are not enormous. We're talking about less than £100 million that moves, as it were, between those two, because there's a relatively small number of CCGs that are more than 5%, as you can see, over target. So I wouldn't want to overstate the differences between options 1 and 2. It is my judgment, which is why we're recommending option 1, that if we want to deal with an equitable settlement, we need to get the money as quickly as possible to those who are underfunded, and we can't leave a situation where we've got some CCGs who are 20 or 30% overfunded, and there is no inroad being made into that. And I would say most of the ones that are significantly overfunded don't appear very often on my list of CCGs that I need to refer to in the kind of deficit part of the table, which is, you know, it's good not to be in deficit, but if you're not in deficit because of that level of overfunding, that's perhaps not something that we can leave intact for very much longer. So that's the recommendation I would make to you. And I think that's probably all I want to say. There are some comments in there about primary care. It's effectively things that we can do to add to the transparency of what we've done, to show it in the context of the other bits of primary care which are not part of what I've just described, how we can look at social care and public health on top of that. There's a long consideration of whether we should be factoring in the interesting fate of social care into all of this. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't, because we haven't got the data to do that, and indeed the data doesn't yet exist about the impact of social care around the place. But we don't believe it to be appropriate in any case to start changing allocations for the health system in response to potentially very uneven sets of social care challenges around the country. So my recommendation is that we build as much transparency around the place-based allocations as we can, but we stick to the already complex enough set of things that we've just talked about. So may I just pause for breath and inspiration at that point? If there are any, again, questions or observations about pace of change, the choice between those two options, now would be a good time to raise it.
Right, let me invite any questions from colleagues on the board. Kieran?
It's an opinion, really, rather than a question. I think if we want to end up with no CCG more than 2.5% underfunded or 66, more than 2.5, and it's a relatively small balance. Why on earth wouldn't we want to do that? For me, it seems obvious. And by the way, we've got 5 years to do it. It doesn't feel reckless pace to me. It just feels slightly more effort or whatever.
Can I just add one question on that, though, Malcolm, which is, to what extent, when we're capping the growth in those who have more than 5% overfunded, to what extent are there areas of real sort of deprivation, or areas where you mentioned that they don't feature on your degree of deficit? It is only 4, or what, from 20, we're talking about 8 over the 3-year time horizon, so it's not a huge number of CCGs we're talking about here, I think. But you can assure us that there's nothing sort of very difficult going on there in terms of areas of high deprivation.
So I can give you an assurance, I think, that finance is not a reason why those areas are struggling, and it wouldn't, that what we're changing here wouldn't pose an unmanageable burden on them. Yeah.
John?
First of all, say that's 4 billion.
I mean, not only the amount of work, but also your grasp of the detail is truly impressive. The issue of linking specialised services, which we have a special interest as board members, to CCGs is obviously a complex one. And you've used the word judgment once or twice, which implies that there will be others who will disagree with some of these judgments. One of the thoughts that occurred to me as you were speaking was that some of the specialised services are patchy. One could imagine scenarios, for example, hepatitis C being more concentrated in some CCGs than others, or certain rare diseases which are phenomenally expensive, clustering around families in one very localised area. To what extent will there be flexibility to address that sort of lack of averaging, which you've sort of had to use in your original calculation?
Very good question. I didn't draw out that particular detail in what I said. So 2 levels of answer to that. Firstly, there is a variety of services which is so specialised and uneven in the way you describe it that we manage them nationally, and as far as I can conceive, we'll continue to manage them nationally. So they don't really come into this set of equations. We've excluded those effectively from the place-based allocations. This is quite an important detail which I didn't mention. So we're only in the allocations looking at the bits that we wouldn't manage nationally. There are, in varying degrees then within the portfolio, that does come into question for, if you like, total place perspective, things that you would almost certainly choose then to aggregate as a set of commissioners getting involved in co-commission. Clearly at the moment we do it all in reasonably aggregated hubs, and my assumption would be that in future construction some services will be best at least done on that basis, and as we've already reflected, we haven't got concrete plans to change the basis of that anyway. But the sorts of examples you've talked about, Hep C for example, is one that we, I think in all foreseeable circumstances, at the moment at least, would retain in the central clump. That's not a technical term too many. Margaret?
First of all, can I echo John's praise? I thought, in spite of the complexity of what you were trying to explain, it came over really very, very clearly for us as members of the board. And I'm hoping that it came over similarly clearly for members of the public. But I would anticipate that in due course that there will be a sort of simplified version put up onto our information channels. What I was going to ask is, really in connection with the timetable for CCG's coming back in January, and I'm actually very pleased that you're actually moving that timeline forward to allow them to digest their Christmas pudding and come back later. But with ACRA having to look at the formula for specialised commissioning and the risk that's baked into that, given the importance, as Noel pointed out, of the specialised commissioning elements and the co-commissioning push, encouragement, what might the ACRA response do to the timetable if ACRA comes back with, pointing out distortions or anything that we need to deal with?
So they won't affect the timetable because we're not going to wait for ACRA to do its work before we issue all the numbers. So they're not going to do this before the first week of January, to be clear. We will issue the allocations on the basis, subject to any changes that you might wish to make, the basis that we've set out here and on the assumption that ACRA will find what we have done to be accurate and appropriate. I think there are two possible kind of negative scenarios, not ones that I anticipate, but ones that we have to be prepared for. One is that there is a suggestion from ACRA that there's a particular aspect of it that could have been done differently, better, a refinement to what we've done that will be appropriate. And I think in those circumstances, we'd need to look very carefully at the magnitude of that and whether it really required a change before the next time we would do binding allocations, which would be 2 or 3 years, would be 3 years off. I think if ACRA came back and said the whole thing is misguided, I would be a bit disappointed because we have had quite a lot of discussion with them at this stage. But if there's a major thing, we will have to rethink. As my expectation though would be, if there is such a thing, we could manage that by some kind of non-recurrent adjustment in 16-17 if needed, but could adjust beyond that. And as I've already mentioned, there will be other things that we will do as we go into 17-18 and onwards, which will potentially put additional money into the local system. For example, if we can find ways in which some of the elements of transformation can be decentralised, if I can put it that way, into allocations, that would offer an opportunity, if there were also some adjustments that were required from the ACRA review, to kind of wheel them into that. But I say my expectation, and it is nearly Christmas, so I can wish for it as well, I suppose. My expectation is that we will have a smooth ride with this, and it will go through. But it's I wouldn't want in any way to prejudge what ACRA forms as its view in due course.
Thank you, Paul. Mel?
Paul, to contextualise the choice between the options in terms of what this means for patients, in terms of access to GP services, access to emergency and acute, access to mental health, quality of outcomes. At first sight, the U-shaped profile of the per capita means are less than 2 decimal points different between the options. How do you characterise the real difference in what patients would see between our choice between pace of change option 1 and pace of change option 2?
So I think I have to base it on the fact that the best way to get value in the health system is to match money to where the need is, because that will get the money working hardest for patients who are generating that need. So there are, in underfunded CCGs at the moment, clearly needs which cannot be being fulfilled because they haven't got the money to it. And either they're showing a deficit, which frankly just takes the money back from other parts of the health system, or there are services which are not being provided at the cost and therefore the delivery which one would expect. So I think dealing with the underfundedness of CCGs enables them to make the money work in fulfilling the needs of patients. As I've already commented, I think whilst there is doubtless a mixed picture amongst those at the other end of the spectrum, there are a number where the money is simply not working hard enough because it hasn't needed to be frank about it. Right. And I think we need to get the alignment so that every CCG has the same challenge of using the right amount of money for its group of patients to deliver the maximum possible benefit.
Well, may I just ask, there's a couple of paragraphs here where you're not asking us for a decision, paragraphs 61 and 62, but about the combined financial control total for a local health economy and likewise for CCGs working together. It would be quite interesting just to have from you a rather more developed understanding of how this in turn would advance the principles that lie behind the allocations you're inviting us to make.
Yes, okay. So there are really three aspects of the 3 paragraphs, imaginatively enough. So one of which is a fairly simple thing, which is we're giving quite a bit of additional money to some CCGs, indeed a number of CCGs. We need to be absolutely certain that money is going to be spent on plans which have the robustness and all the benefits which Noel was trying to get at, I think, and not just more money which is then being badly directed. So the linkage we've made there is the quality of the integrated plans being done in the summer in those CCGs, and indeed in all CCGs, will be linked to the degree to which they earn the allocations theoretically allocated in this particular paper. I think it's really important from a value for money perspective. It's really important also as a concentrating feature to ensure that the right incentives are in place for CCGs to engage with that process and be successful in it, with all the support that we are going to be giving them to do that. And as I said earlier, it mirrors the incentives for providers to engage with that through the sustainability fund. The second proposal, which I have to say is a reasonably recent piece of thought development, which we will need to work on more, is the shared financial control total. But it comes from a philosophy, at least, that what we're trying to achieve here is health economies, which are as robust and vibrant as possible, as opposed to individual organisations in health economies that, in the worst cases, certainly kind of compete for the financial space and the life of the health economy. So this would encourage those who are going into rather more collaborative modes of working together for finance not to be a barrier to that by them being held to individual control totals. I have to say there is a lot more thought that needs to go into that because, for example, we have accountability for the entire financial performance of the commissioning system, and that is something we need to deliver. So these need to be first thought through, second piloted, and then we will need to work out if it becomes anything more than a set of selective pilots, how we adapt the overall financial regime. And as I've said in the paper, that would require further discussion, not just here, but with partners in NHS improvement and in central government who clearly have a responsibility for the financial regime. But I think that could be a real liberating force if we can make that work to getting the collaboration between providers and commissioners to the peak that we need it to be if we're going to deliver on the difficult challenges. And then the third one is quite an exciting one, which I had contemplated in my London days and never quite got round to doing, and which I know London has been doing quite a bit of thinking about, but it's not a uniquely London problem. It's perhaps best exemplified by London, which is if there are parts of the country which, by mutual consent, want to make sure that they get more quickly to money lined up to where it belongs, we would want to be facilitating of that rather than people stopping that happening and saying, sorry, we've made up the allocations, you have to stick precisely to it. So if you think of the London story massively oversimplified, we have got a significant number of over-target CCGs in the centre of London for a variety of reasons, a lot of under-target CCGs in the outer ring of London. It's entirely conceivable that parts of London, or indeed London as a whole, could choose to try and go faster to balance the financial flows there. It's equally possible that Manchester, and I'm only picking on devolution places because they're already starting the thinking about how to work together in that way. But it's something we would want to facilitate where it is coming up organically from the local health economies concerned. It's not something we are planning to impose on anyone because by definition it needs to be a consensual process.
Thank you. Kieran?
Just to say, I think this is great, but it's also only half the story. What are the other critical success factors we need to get to where we need to get to? So, we need people who really understand their populations and the evidence, people who've got a really good vision of where they want to take things, skills being built into the health economies that can do that, and really engaged clinicians and staff across the NHS. So I think this is fabulous and it's a great piece of work and moves us in the right direction. But it's just I still have this kind of better sailing ship kind of worry that, actually it's only half of the story. And, in saying this is brilliant, which is probably what I really want to say, let's not forget the other bit as well.
Thank you. Victor?
Deeply impressive presentations of all the formulas. And I think the last point about really how this allocation drives the right set of behaviours in the system, either convening, which is what we're going to have to do basically to get place-based health correct, or driving outcomes that make sense to people. That kind of makes sense to me. The thing that's been going around in my mind is that it's not necessarily the impact of any one formula on an area. It's our understanding of the combinations of all the things that we've agreed in a particular area. Now, I'm not asking you that because I think you've got an answer to it. I don't think you do, but I think it's a challenge, isn't it? Because if you look at the deprivation formula, it perfectly it makes sense. It moves in the right direction, but then there's another set of applications of formulas that will impact on the same area, and we don't know how. So I felt the need to say it because I think it's the truth of the matter. You see what I mean? And it's a challenge to us in understanding the combinations rather than the individual impact, as brilliantly as they've been formulated, and it really is. I mean, brilliant.
How very kind, and I take the challenge as well, which is as much a challenge for me as anyone else.
I don't think it's just a challenge for you, by the way. I think it's a challenge for the NHS England, frankly.
Right, well, can I just check that the board now feel in a position where you're confident to take the decisions that we're being asked to do? First of all, I think, just picking up on that last point, understanding that what we're doing is a huge part of providing an improvement in the quality of healthcare for the population, but it is a part. Decisions taken around social care and around public health and indeed across all parts of government are also major contributors. Secondly, to confirm with everybody that what we are doing is committing this organisation for 5 years, subject to the reservations in Annex A, that you need to feel absolutely comfortable that the paper and the explanation that we've had from Paul takes us to a place where we're confident to take those decisions. Thirdly, that it is indeed, albeit at a high level, the best way that we can conceive of driving forward the principles of the forward view and getting maximum value for patients plus fairness in redressing some historical distortions in the way that allocations have been made. So subject to those overarching criteria, can I put to you, please, the following questions? First, to ask you to agree the proposed allocation of funds between areas of commissioning spend, including in that the establishment of the Sustainability and Transformation Fund, and including within that a £450 million allocation to Greater Manchester. So please, can I ask you first to signal your approval of that? Right, thank you. Secondly, to agree the proposed approach to allocation within CCG, primary care and specialised commissioning streams. We're all agreed on that, thank you. Thirdly, to approve the proposed approach to pace of change and to put specifically to you option 1, which is the option recommended to us by the team. Good, thank you very much. And then finally, to agree the proposals set out in paragraphs 60 to 62 with regard to integrated planning, etc., that Paul's just explained to us. Thank you very much. I mean, just I think to emphasise for everybody that this is a very high-level exercise. The board has not been cited, deliberately not been cited, on what would be the changes in allocations to individual CCGs. I mean, I think it's important to stress that this is being done entirely at the high level. Secondly, to ask you to preserve back a very residual discretion to the Chief Executive and to me as Chairman in governance terms, should we need to make any minor alterations. I do not at this moment anticipate that that would be necessary, but please, if you're comfortable to do that. And thirdly, to understand that the decisions that we have now taken provide the authority necessary for the team to proceed with the individual CCG level allocations. Can I just check everybody's content with that? Well, it falls to me only on the back of all of that to repeat again our warmest thanks to the team. I mean, what may not be generally understood is the amount of pressure under which this has been undertaken, given the proximity of the spending review and the long hours and the hard work that's been put into it. And I think I particularly recognise Sam, Stephen and John, who are with us today as our emergency backup should anything fail in our major power supply, i.e. Paul, and to ask you, Paul, and through those three, to convey our gratitude to everybody else who's put so much effort into it. And also our understanding that we will only deliver all of this in partnership with the other arm's length bodies, the Department of Health and everybody else who's engaged in the exercise. So Paul, thank you to you personally and to the team.
Thank you.